All right. Well, on behalf of the leadership here at Science, Scripture, and Reason, I'd like to welcome you to our March 2026 meeting. And we have a very special guest with us this evening, Dr. Hugh Ross. For many of us, Hugh does not need an introduction, but for those of you who don't know Hugh, he's the founder and senior scholar at Reasons to Believe, which is an organization that exists to open people to the gospel by revealing God in science. Hugh holds a degree in physics from the University of British Columbia and a PhD in astronomy from the University of Toronto. After 5 years on the Caltech faculty, Hugh went into full-time ministry and still serves on the pastoral team at Christchurch Sierra Madre. His writings include peer-reviewed journal and magazine articles and numerous books, including The Creator and the Cosmos, more recently Rescuing Inerrancy, and his most recent book, Noah's Flood Revisited, which he will be expanding on this evening. And I might say in a personal note that I consider Hugh one of my spiritual mentors. It was over 30 years ago that I first heard him speak at a church here in Sacramento, Fremont Presbyterian. And from that time on, he opened my eyes to the integration of science and scripture, the two-book approach. And it has been a fantastic journey to learn more and to be able to both understand God and science better and to have a deeper appreciation and worship. So I really appreciate Hugh. And there are a few people who, anytime they write something, I'm always out to look to read it. And Hugh is one of them. So Hugh, thank you. Thank you for being here this evening. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. We just, in our scholar community, completed a book club on Noah's Flood Revisited. It's about 25 minutes of video recording. I think it's 6 or 7 episodes, but the goal is to release it for all of you. So if you want to start a book club, we give you the resources to make that happen. We basically show the video, then turn it open for Q&A. And what I've done with book clubs that people start is say, hey, run the book club. And at the very end, you can pull me in for an open mic Q&A with a group. So if any of you are interested in that, we can make that happen for you. And what I'm going to do this evening is kind of give you some of the highlights of what's in this book, Noah's Flood Revisited. And it's a book I wanted to write 10 years ago, but I purposely waited until the science came in to really nail down the events of Genesis 10 and 11. Nailing that down allows us to solve a lot of the problems that people raise about Genesis 6, 7, and 8. So let me share the screen. Here we go. And hey, if you don't get to ask a question, we are going to have a Q&A time tonight, but I do take questions on a daily basis on both my Facebook and X pages. So take advantage of that. And if you're not already a subscriber to the Reasons to Believe YouTube channel, you can take advantage of that. It's free, and we're posting videos nearly every day. Well, tonight I thought I would focus on the real debate about Noah's flood. Is it a global event? Is it a local event? Or is it a worldwide event? And I'll define these 3 terms. The global flood theory is the belief that Noah's flood inundated all Earth's surface a few thousand years ago, and the consequence was to produce virtually all of Earth's geological features, nearly all of Earth's fossils, and all of Earth's biodeposits. That's the global flood interpretation, almost entirely within the young Earth creationist community. The local flood view is that Noah's flood flooded a portion of Mesopotamia a few thousand years ago, wiping out 1 or 2 complete tribes of humanity. So rather than wiping out all of humanity, they claim it wiped out the totality of one, two, maybe three tribes of humanity. Now, the worldwide flood, which is what I defend in the book Noah's Flood Revisited, is the belief that Noah's flood inundated all the land masses that were inhabited by humans and their animals, not a few thousand years ago, but sometime during the previous ice age, several tens of thousands of years ago. And when you have the flood that far back in time, humanity is not occupying all the world's land masses. So you can literally wipe out all of humanity and all their animals, except for those on board the ark, without having the flood being globally extensive. Now, what does the Bible say? And one of my motivations for writing this book, Noah's Flood Revisited, is to make the point there's more content outside the book of Genesis about Noah's flood than inside the book of Genesis. The reason this is so controversial, people just tend to focus in on just those three chapters in Genesis. And again, my motivation for writing this book, what I've discovered over the past 30 years, is that the number one reason why people reject the Bible as the inspired, inerrant Word of God is they look at the account of the flood and they say there's no way that can be true. If that isn't true, there's no point in my reading anything else in the Bible. So yeah, I was motivated to remove the number one stumbling block from people trusting the Bible as God's Word. But the principle I'm going to invoke here is that before you draw a conclusion on what the Bible is saying, you want to integrate all the relevant biblical texts. And what's interesting is that the global flood view did not even wasn't even expressed by any Bible scholars until the late 17th century. And the significant part of that, and by the way, was only in England and Holland. But that was the first time that any nation developed a global navy. England and Holland were the first nations to develop a global navy. That happened in the late 17th century. And that was the first time you had Bible scholars explicitly speculating that the flood of Noah may have been globally extensive. And again, those theologians were only those resident in England and Holland at that time. So what I've done in the book is to actually give you a survey. This is just some of the passages, but what I do in the book is I give you an exhaustive survey of all the places in the Bible where it talks about a worldwide event. Now, what's interesting is that not until you get to the book of Revelation do you see worldwide events that encompass all the land masses on the face of the earth. Previous to Revelation, that's not the case. So, for example, in Genesis chapter 41, we're told that Joseph fed the whole world. Genesis 42 defines the whole world as the extent of the Egyptian empire and the land of Canaan. And in 1 Kings 10, we learn that the kings and queens of the whole world came to Jerusalem to hear of the wisdom of Solomon. And you read a few verses beyond in 1 Kings, and it tells us that these kings and queens came from as far away as Ethiopia, which is in Ethiopia, and the whole extent of Arabia. That was the whole world of King Solomon. And Acts 2:5 talks about how in Pentecost, Jews from all over the whole world came to Jerusalem to celebrate the Pentecost. But it's quite clear that Luke in Acts is not referring to Jews actually living in North and South America or Australia. The whole world was the Roman Empire. And Romans 1:8, similar thing, Paul says of the Roman Christians, your faith has been heard throughout the whole world, and he meant the extent of the Roman Empire. And so, here's a reference here, Romans 8:1, your faith is being reported all over the world. He meant the Roman world. Obviously, the Aztecs and Maoris at that time did not hear of the Roman Christians' faith. So, you can have a worldwide event without it being global in the context of the 66 books of the Bible. What about the extent of Noah's flood? And a lot of people think this is debatable. What's interesting is that if you actually look at passages outside of the book of Genesis, it actually helps you to quite explicitly define the extent of Noah's flood. Again, the principle, you want to integrate all the relevant biblical texts. I mean, I'll just give you one example. People make the point, hey, if the flood wasn't global, why didn't God just have Noah and his family pick up their belongings and animals and move away? Well, only the New Testament tells us that God had raised up Noah to be a preacher to his generation. If he had moved away, he would not have had that opportunity to preach repentance to his generation. Now, what you do find in the Old Testament is that before God brings judgment upon human reprobate behavior, he always sends a prophet first. So, for example, before he destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, he sent Lot in the city gate to preach repentance to the Sodomites. Likewise, before he brought destruction upon Nineveh, he sent Jonah. God always sends a prophet. And so a big reason why Noah didn't move away and why God had him build this enormous wooden ship in a place where it doesn't rain. It got people's attention. It gave Noah the opportunity to preach. But as we look outside the book of Genesis, we see passages that are quite explicit in talking about the extent of Noah's flood. So, for example, you got Psalm 104. It's the longest of the creation psalms. There are 5 creation psalms, but Psalm 104 actually takes you through the events of all 6 creation days. Doesn't do it chronologically, but actually topically raises the events of each creation day. And when it addresses creation day 3, this is what it says, referring to God. You covered it, namely the earth, with the deep. The waters stood above the mountains, but at your rebuke the waters fled. They went down into the valleys to the place you assigned for them. That's verses 6, 7, and 8. Here's what verse 9 says. You set a boundary, they, namely the waters, cannot cross. Never again will they cover the earth. So, creation day 3 is when God transforms our planet from a water world where there's only water on the surface, where you now have coexisting continents and oceans. And what Psalm 104 is saying is once the continents are in place, never again will water cover the entire surface of the earth. This is repeated in 3 other creation psalms. It's repeated in Job 38. It's also repeated in Proverbs chapter 8. Now, when you get to the New Testament, it says in 2 Peter 3:6, by water also the world of that time, referring to Noah's time, was deluged and destroyed. The point I want you to see here is that the Greek word cosmos for world or universe, it's qualified. It's cosmos tote or tote cosmos. And here's the amplified definition. World at the time the event took place. So what Peter is doing is contrasting the world of Noah with the world of Rome, the world at the time the event took place. Then we see in 2 Peter chapter 2, again referring to Noah's flood, says God brought this flood upon the world of the ungodly. And once again, the word cosmos is qualified. If God intended that it was the entire surface of the earth, you would see in both instances cosmos without any qualification. But every time Peter talks about the world that was flooded, he qualifies the word cosmos. In other words, the entire world of ungodly people was inundated. Everywhere ungodly people lived, the planet was inundated. And hey, if you go back to the book of Genesis, it's not just the people that are wiped out, it's the animals associated with the people that are wiped out. But the implication is animals that had no association with humans would not be touched by Noah's flood. So in the flood model we're talking about in Noah's Flood Revisited, we don't have emperor penguins on board the ark. We don't have koalas on board the ark. We don't have Amazonian sloths on board the ark because people didn't live in those regions, which means that the animals there were not damaged by human sin. And this is a principle you see in the book of Leviticus. Only animals that are in contact with wicked people develop behavior that makes them harmful. So, for example, you see in the book of Leviticus that if a cow has a habit of goring other animals and people, the owner of that cow is to be rebuked. And if the cow continues in that behavior, the cow is to be killed, and the owner of the cow also is to be killed. And the principle here is that God designed birds and mammals that when they're in relationship with humans, they're strongly motivated to serve and please those humans. And if what brings pleasure to the human owner is for the animal to viciously attack other people and animals, that's exactly how the animal will behave. So vicious dogs are owned by vicious human beings. Now, when you run into people who claim that the flood is global, almost always they cite Genesis 7:19. This is their biblical case for the global flood, because the text says that the waters rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered, and they were covered to a depth of 15 cubits, which is 22 feet. But you see in brackets there, I made the point that the word for high can also mean elevated, and the word for mountain can also mean hill. The word har can mean mountain, hill, or a mound in your backyard. So it's basically all the elevated mounds or hills that Noah could see were covered with water. And I say Noah could see based on what you see in Genesis chapter 8, verse 5, and Genesis 8, verse 9. So here we got Noah, the floodwaters are receding, and in verse 5, he can see the tops of the distant mountains or hills. They became visible to Noah. So the floodwaters are receding, he could see these distant hills, and so we got Noah here on top of the ark. He's able to see the distant hills, but we see a few verses later, in verse 9, he releases a dove. And the dove flies over the waters, and what does the text say? The dove could find no place to set its feet, because there was water over all the surface of the earth. It's the same phrase you see in Genesis 7:19, which means we are to interpret Genesis 7:19 that at the height of the flood, Noah on top of the ark could only see water from one horizon to the other. All the hills from one horizon to the other were covered with water to a depth of 22 feet or greater. Now this means we're not just talking, a portion of Mesopotamia being covered with water. If that were the case, he'd be able to see distant hills. The flood is so extensive that Noah on top of the ark could only see water from one horizon to the other. And likewise, with the dove flying relatively low over the water, that dove could only see water from one horizon to the other. And the difference between Noah and the dove, Noah was probably some 40 feet above the surface of the water. The dove may have been 20 feet above the surface of the water. And that extra 20 feet makes a huge difference. It's the crow's nest effect. Put a sailor up in the crow's nest, 30 feet above the flooring of the hull of a ship, he can literally see 10, 20 miles farther away than people that are on the deck of the ship. Now, I purposely waited till a couple of years ago to begin writing this book, Noah's Flood Revisited, because I knew that reliable dates for the events of Genesis 10 and 11 were coming, not just one dating method, but 4 independent methods. So I waited till that research was published. And coming with a date for Noah's flood, because one of the big reasons why people read the Bible and say this is utter scientific nonsense, they presume that Noah's flood happened 5,000, 6,000 years ago. But I argue in the book the flood of Noah predated that by a considerable period of time. And the point here is that from a biblical perspective, the genealogies really are no help for dating Noah's flood. People attempt to do that. They do that by assuming there's no gaps in the generations of the biblical genealogies. But if you assume no gaps, you get a different date for Noah's flood if you start from Adam and go forward than if you start from Moses and go backward. And so even on the Answers in Genesis website, where they try to argue that the flood is globally extensive and relatively recent, when they calculate a date from Adam, they come up with the flood happening in 2348 BC. But if they start from Moses, they come up with a date of 2458 BC. Difference of 110 years. That alone tells you that the genealogies cannot be used to come up with an accurate date. And hey, if you compare all the genealogies in the Bible that overlap one another, it's quite clear that most of the generations are omitted. So you begin comparing the genealogies in the New Testament, what you see in Chronicles, you can see a very large number of generations are omitted. And the point here is that in the Old Testament, the Hebrew word for father, Ab, can mean grandfather, great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, etc. In fact, we just see in the book of Daniel, you've got Belshazzar referring to Nebuchadnezzar as his father. And, there's 4 generations between them, and they're not even blood relatives. And so in the English, when you read the Genesis 5 and 11 genealogies, it reads, when X had lived Y years, he fathered Z. But keep in mind, the Hebrew word for father has way more breadth than is the case with the English word. Same thing true, by the way, for the Hebrew word for son, ben. It equally means grandson, great-great-grandson, etc. So the likely biblical Hebrew would be saying this: when X had lived Y years, he fathered a family line that included or culminated in Z. So that would allow for a considerable number of generations to exist between X and Z, which would allow a date for Noah's flood deep into the previous ice age. Now, what we do see explicitly stated in Genesis chapter 8 is that it took a full year for the flood waters to recede. Now, the text is clear where the flood waters came from: 40 days and 40 nights of torrential rain. And incidentally, that's a strong indication it's an ice age event. Today, when we have a huge hurricane dumping a lot of rain, the hurricane will dump rain on a region for maybe 2 or 3 days. Then it wanders away and dissipates. But during the last ice age, there were hurricanes and cyclones that would dump water for weeks on end. So that's one argument for why Noah's flood likely is an ice age event. But another reason is, hey, 40 days and 40 nights of torrential rain combined with tectonic events that push water up from the underground aquifers, it's liquid water. Liquid water flows relatively rapidly out into the oceans. Even in a very flat plain, it's going to flow into the oceans within a matter of a few weeks or less. Something must be replacing that liquid water. And I argue that, hey, if we're talking about the flood happening during the previous ice age, during the previous ice age, there were 8 really major rapid melt events of hundreds, in some cases thousands of feet thickness of ice. And ice has a property of melting slowly, and so the melting of ice from a major melt event in the previous ice age could explain why the flood lasted 375 days. As the liquid water floated in the ocean, that liquid water is being replaced by the melting of ice and snow on the mountains around that. Now, we see in Genesis is that Noah's flood predates the great dispersals or migrations that are described in Genesis 10 and 11. And what you notice is in Genesis 2 and 3, God commands Adam and Eve to multiply and fill the earth. And what we see in Genesis chapter 9, after Noah's flood, God commands Noah with the same command: multiply and fill the earth. Basically, and by the way, it's repeated twice, and the language is stronger than what you see in Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And so, God, that implies that humanity, uh, before the great dispersions, before Noah's flood, had not multiplied and filled the earth. They remained in one region. God strongly commanded Noah, hey, don't repeat what happened with Adam's descendants. You must multiply and fill the earth. But what do we see in Genesis chapter 11? Humanity gathers. They build this big city and this big tower. Why? So that we will not be scattered over the face of the earth. And God knew that if they stayed in one place with one city and one government, that government would oppress its citizens. What we see in Genesis chapter 11 is God exercising antitrust legislation. He knew that a single nation is a prescription for the repeat of the evil that took place before Noah's flood. His goal is that multiple nations would need to compete with one another for citizens. And so he forcibly scatters humanity over the face of the earth, and the text tells us he'd already designed the land masses with natural geographical barriers that would allow a weaker nation to live adjacent to a stronger nation. So this is a picture we see in Genesis chapter 11. God scattering humanity out of the near Middle East and Eastern Africa into all the parts of Europe, Asia, Australia, Africa. And during the previous ice age, we have sea levels that are 20 to 390 feet lower, which means you've got a land bridge joining France to Britain and to Ireland. You've got a land bridge joining Korea to Japan. You can walk from Southeast Asia into the Philippines. Here's a map actually showing you what Southeast Asia looked like. And you can see, you can literally walk to Borneo. You can walk to the Philippines. You can't walk to Australia, but the sea levels are low enough that people on the South Indonesian islands can see with their naked eye the land of Australia, and consequently build wooden boats that could take them from those islands into Australia. And Australia at that time, there were land bridges connecting it to New Guinea and to Tasmania. Now, we now have 4 reliable dating methods to determine when these great migrations happen, how quickly they happen. We can even determine the migration routes that were used. And so the 4 methods are: we now can recover fossils of anatomically modern human remains that date back 40,000 years, 45,000 years ago. And likewise, we can find archaeological artifacts that are associated with anatomically modern humans. So only anatomically modern humans, for example, had shovels and axes and bows and arrows. And so recovering these artifacts would enable them to date when they moved into certain regions. And we now know what distinguishes anatomically modern humans from Neanderthals, the Denisovans, Homo erectus, all the other bipedal primate species, is that we have weak jaw muscles and we have a rather facile jawbone, which means we're compelled to eat soft food. We can't survive on raw food. And so we now know that Adam and Eve had to be grinding their food, roasting it and boiling it to make it soft enough that they could eat. And humans also, even though they have a smaller body than, say, the Neanderthals, we need a lot more calories. Our brain, for example, consumes about 1/3 of the energy that we take into our stomach. Excuse me. And so one thing we can do is we can date evidence for food preparation and food cooking as people migrate out from the near Middle East to all the other parts of the world. And whereas mathematical genetic models have really big error bars when you're trying to date When did the first woman live? When did the first man live? These mathematical genetics models do give reliable results if we're talking about events that go back, say, 40 to 50,000 years ago. The error bars are much smaller. Well, it's interesting when you look at when humans first came into Europe. If you look at these four methods, you get the same dates. The fossils of dead humans, 45 to 39,000 years ago. The artifacts, 42 to 38,000 years ago. Evidence for cooking food, that evidence is going to be harder to find, but it's at least 40,000 years ago. And the genetics models give you dates of 45 to 39,000 years ago. But what I find interesting is when you look at these four methods throughout the entire old world, you get identical dates for when you have Western Africa settled, for when you get Eastern Asia settled, Southern Europe, Northern Europe, and New Guinea, Australia, and Tasmania. Now, if this was just a natural migration process, you would expect that you would have evidence for Southern Europe to be settled before Northern Europe. I mean, the human body is not well designed for a cold climate. So yeah, you'd expect the warmer realms to be settled first and the coldest realms to be settled last. When you look at Eastern Asia, for example, Northern Siberia is settled at the same time as India and China and Southeast Asia and Borneo and Japan. So this really does give credence to what the Bible says, that God supernaturally intervened and aggressively scattered humanity of the Near Middle East to all the parts of Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Sahel. Now, this next map right here, graph here, shows you the 6 major melt events that occurred previous to 40,000 years ago. And what you see here is that the global mean temperature at these 6 instances jumped up 8 to 10 degrees centigrade in a space of centuries, certainly less than 1,000 years. And so I'm arguing that probably the most reasonable date for Noah's flood is one of these 6 major melt events, because a sudden rise of temperature of that degree would indeed melt hundreds of feet thickness of ice in a matter of decades. Now, these 6 events, they occur between 47,000 years ago and 87,000 years ago. So I would argue that a reasonable estimate for when Noah's flood occurred would be 60 to 90,000 years ago. If you want a conservative estimate, 55,000 years ago to 120,000 years ago. I say 55 because when you look at the genealogy in Genesis 11, there's a considerable number of generations between Noah and the great scattering of humanity by the hand of God. The 120,000 year date is when the last ice age began. It began 120,000 years ago and persisted until about 13,000 years ago. But we got evidence for the great scattering that takes us back to about 50,000 years ago. So a reasonable date, 60 to 90,000 years ago. A conservative date, 55,000 to 120,000 years ago. Now, in the book Noah's Flood Revisited was actually at the press, I called our team and said, can you please not print it yet? Give me a few more days. And it's because a paper got published in the scientific literature documenting what they discovered was the remnants of thick, long pieces of rope on the southernmost Indonesian islands, basically demonstrating that 44 to 50,000 years ago, humans were manufacturing long, thick pieces of rope to be used to steer large wooden ships, basically making the point that humans 44 to 50,000 years ago certainly had the technology to build large wooden ships and even make them steerable. And in the case of Noah's Ark, it didn't have to be steered. And hey, if they were building large wooden ships 44 to 50,000 years ago, I don't think Noah would have a problem building a wooden boat 450 feet long. And the biblical text actually allows for as much as 100 years for Noah to build the ark with the help of his family. I think he was wealthy, so he probably was able to hire people to assist him in building that ark. Now, a lot of people have made the point, hey, there's no way you can build a large wooden ship that's 450 feet long because the largest wooden ships that were built in the 19th century were only 300 feet long. They discovered they built them bigger than that. They weren't seaworthy. Well, keep in mind, these were ships that had to sail quickly from North America to Europe. And if you want them to sail fast, you're going to need big masts with sails on them. And yes, the limit is about 300 feet long if you manufacture these ships out of oak. But what I notice in the Bible, the Old Testament, mentions 21 distinct species of hardwood. It also mentions 5 species of softwood. Clearly, the ark wasn't made out of a softwood. It had to be made out of a hardwood. But those 21 hardwoods, uh, nearly all of them have a strength index considerably greater than live oak that was used to build the big wooden ships of the Clipper era. And some of them have a strength index that's more than double that of live oak. And the fact is, the Bible says that God commanded Noah to make it a gopher wood. I argue that gopher wood has to have a stronger strength index than the 21 other species of hardwood that are mentioned in the Old Testament. And acacia, which is frequently mentioned, it easily has a strength index sufficient to build a wooden ship 450 feet long that doesn't need to be steered in any particular direction. And hey, if you want the reference for these large ships 44 to 50,000 years ago, the title of the paper is Seafaring in Pleistocene Wallacea. It's published in the Journal of Archaeological Science Reports. Put it into a search engine, it'll pop up. It got published in April of 2025. Now, the last thing I want to address before I throw it open to Q&A is a lot of skeptics have said, hey, these floodwaters are receding. These waters flowed downhill, but the biblical text says the ark came to rest on the foothills of Ararat, the mountains of Ararat. That means that the ark had to go uphill instead of downhill. Well, the physicist Alan Hill, I cite his work in the book, he points out that during the previous ice age, you got cyclones that can blow for weeks, even months on end. And so he points out if there's a large ice age cyclone in the Indian Ocean, it would have sustained wind velocities of above 50 miles an hour, which could easily push a fully loaded ark weighing 5,000 tons 700 miles inland where it would run aground on the foothills of Ararat. Bottom line, by the way, I gave a talk on Noah's flood shortly after the book came out to a couple of hundred research scientists and theologians. Their response to my talk was, this solves all the problems. In conclusion, no longer is a Genesis account of Noah's flood a scientific embarrassment or a biblical embarrassment. The biggest barrier to people trusting the Bible as God's inerrant word now has been removed, thanks to looking at all 66 books of the Bible and examining the latest scientific findings concerning the great scattering of humanity. So I'll take Q&A, and as always, I'll take questions in any subject. Whatever you got in your mind, I'm more than happy to try to address.
Thank you, Hugh. That was so wonderful. So the floor is open. Anyone on Zoom or here in the room, please ask your question. Come on up.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm curious if it's explained at all in the Bible or if there's other uh, non-biblical ideas about how God dispersed Noah's people
Yeah,
generations like.
yeah, the genetic evidence is quite revealing, showing that there was a very rapid migration along the coasts of Africa, the southern shore of Europe, and the southern shore of Asia. They did not go into North and South America right away because even though there was a bridge joining Alaska to North America, it was very cold until about 17,000 years ago. And so 16,500 years ago, so we have the first undisputed evidence of humans migrating from Asia into North America. I actually argue there's a reference to that in Genesis 10:25, where the text says the world was divided in the days of Peleg, making a reference to the fact that as the ice of the last ice age was melting, the sea levels rapidly rose, and then you had the Bering Strait forming, and no longer was it possible for humans in North America to connect with humans in Asia. They were cut off from one another. This is actually well documented in the totem pole records of the natives living off the coast of British Columbia. In fact, the sea levels were rising so fast that people in one land region couldn't make it to the opposite land region.
I guess my curiosity is more, how did he go about forcing the people to disperse amongst all over the earth?
Well, the text tells us he gave them different languages, which meant that they couldn't communicate with one another easily. So I kind of stopped the thing of gathering all the people together in one nation. Well, you're obviously going to be motivated to communicate and develop tribes within people that speak a common language. So it was one technique that God used. But the text is clear that God is the one that's responsible for the scattering. In other words, this isn't natural migration where people say, hey, it's easier to get food in that part of the world. Let's move and go there. No, this is God forcibly scattering them. So the text is silent on exactly how, but I can imagine that, hey, the goal to build this big city and this big tower was people had the goal, let's have a powerful government that can control the behavior of people. And maybe there was enough oppression and persecution going on that highly motivated people, I got to get out of here. Who knows? Again, I'm speculating.
Thank you.
If I understand correctly, Neanderthals are not related to human beings at all. And yet, when people do blood tests, sometimes it comes back, you're 2% Neanderthal. And then there's the issue of, well, two different species usually can't procreate. Do you have an explanation as to why someone would have Neanderthal blood?
Yeah, it's a major debate. What is clear is that our DNA is remarkably similar to Neanderthal DNA. But keep in mind that's true of all species of life. So about 99% of our DNA is the same as Neanderthal DNA. Keep in mind, though, we can only compare parts of the genome. There may be bigger differences in the parts we can't compare. But also recognize 26% of your DNA is identical to daffodil DNA. I mean, all life forms have to deal with the same metabolic challenges. So we would expect that the DNA would be quite similar. Now, what is interesting is when you look at that 1% that's different, and what we notice is that that 1% really focuses on the head anatomy and the brain. So we now know is that Neanderthals had a brain that weighed about the same as our brain does, but the brain had to manage a much bigger and more muscular body. It actually had to manage way bigger eyes. The eyesight of Neanderthals was superior to ours, but that took up a lot of brain tissue to sustain that. And their brain is shaped differently. Their brain is shaped like a Coke can, cylindrical. Ours is globular, which means we can have big frontal and parietal lobes, which is where we do all of our mathematics, philosophy, and theology. That was missing in the case of the Neanderthals. The other big difference is we've now discovered a gene that's unique to humans and not present in Neanderthals that basically tells us the human brain has a much higher neuronal density. So, for example, a raven's brain is much smaller than that of a chimpanzee, but the raven is much more intelligent than a chimpanzee because it's got a brain structure similar to what we humans have, so it's a different shape. Moreover, the neuronal density of raven brain tissue is way higher than chimpanzee tissue. So I made the comment earlier that about a third of the food that we eat provides energy for the brain. 3 pounds of our body mass consumes a third of our energy. And that's because of just all the neurons that are up there. But it explains why, for example, Neanderthals were here 400,000 years ago. They disappeared 45,000 years ago. Their technology never advanced beyond simple stones. Humans show up on the scene, and with a matter of a few tens of thousands of years, we're putting people on the moon and putting sophisticated machines on bodies as far away as Saturn and Jupiter. So, and that's because our brain is so different. Now, it is true that people of European descent have a little more similarity with Neanderthal DNA than we see with people living in sub-Saharan Africa who would have had no contact with the Neanderthals. That's the basis for people claiming there was interbreeding between Neanderthals and humans. And people also point out when we dig up Europeans that have been dead for 40,000 years, they have a greater similarity than Europeans today. So again, that's an argument for the interbreeding. But here are a couple of caveats. Number one, Europeans were living in the same region as the Neanderthals. They were facing the same environmental pressures. So that alone would explain some of the extra similarity. And number two, Europeans living 40,000 years ago weren't able to move around like Europeans today. So notice there's a lot more DNA mixture going on in Europe today than would have been the case 1,000 years ago when people lacked the technology to be able to move around or make contact with people that had distinctly different DNA. The debate's not settled.
Okay, thank you.
It sounds to me like the next big diet craze is going to be something involving, rather than protein intake, it should be puzzle solving.
Well, my son's a clinical neuropsychologist, and he's written papers on what you need to do to put off dementia happening in your life. Diet is a big factor, but another big factor is making sure that you have daily challenging mental exercise and also daily challenging physical exercise. And, I got to visit a couple that lived in an Alzheimer's unit in Florida, and it was staffed by Alzheimer's researchers. And I got to meet this woman whose Alzheimer's had not advanced over a 10-year period. But she was on a strict diet, and she told me she did an hour of hard physical exercise every day, an hour of hard mental exercise every day, and 2 hours of social engagement. Now, it helped that they were retired. They could actually devote that kind of time to those exercises, but also tells us maybe we should pursue jobs where, well, number one, we can eat right, and part of our job involves challenging mental exercise and physical exercise. I don't think you're going to make it to 950 years like Noah did, though.
Now, I know a lot of the supportive arguments for global flooding involves the geology of the Grand Canyon. Can you kind of touch on that?
Yeah, I can. The people who promote a global flood, they also have these tours that you can take down the Grand Canyon, where they point to all the layers in the Grand Canyon, where we got strong scientific evidence that those layers were formed very rapidly. And they use that to claim, number one, that the Earth is young, and number two, that all that layering was caused by a single event, Noah's flood. Here's the truth. Some of those layers indeed were laid down very rapidly, but not all at the same time. There were multiple flood events that are responsible for those layers. They're all time separated from one another. So it's not a single flood that deposited them all. And I've had friends that gone down with young Earth creationists on those tours, and they would say, well, you pointed out that layer, but what about that layer? And the response is, well, we're not going to talk about those layers. Those layers are the ones where you got strong scientific evidence that they were laid down very slowly. And so global flood people like to claim there's a debate between uniformitarian geologists and catastrophist geologists. That's a misrepresentation of the geological scientific community. They're all catastrophists. In other words, they believe that there are multiple catastrophic events responsible for major geological features, but they're interspersed with these very gradual uniformitarian events that are going on. And so the Grand Canyon is a testimony of 2.5 billion years of the Earth's past history. And what's going on is you got the Colorado River cutting a channel. At the same time, plate tectonics is lifting up the Arizona and the Colorado Plateau. And that explains all the layers there. So yeah, if you ever go on one of those tours, ask them to talk about all the layers, not just a few where they got evidence for rapid deposition. And incidentally, I've got a chapter in the book where I talk about why you can't squeeze nearly all the Earth's geology into 1 year. That would require squeezing 40,000 kilometers of plate tectonic movement into a single year. And hey, we live in California, right? Or at least a lot of us do. I personally felt what 2 inches of plate tectonic movement can do to our home and the furniture in our home. Multiply that up to 40,000 kilometers, no one survives. In fact, the mechanism global flood people claim is responsible for all this geology is hyperaccelerated radioisotope decay. But that hyperaccelerated radioisotope decay would instantly vaporize every animal and plant on the planet, would vaporize all the water, and turn our Earth into a molten mass. The biblical text is quite clear that didn't happen.
Hey, Doctor. Just a quick question. What are your thoughts on Pangea and how that they teach that in the textbooks? What are your thoughts on that in relation to the global flood and Noah's?
Yeah, good question. What I find interesting, the global flood proponents now accept that Pangea indeed existed. They also accept that Rodinia existed. So their latest model of Noah's flood is that you got this supercontinent Rodinia existing at the beginning of Noah's flood. It splits apart during Noah's flood, comes back together as Pangea as a supercontinent, then splits apart into the continents we have today. So even if you accept that, that's still 24,000 kilometers of plate tectonic movement happening within 1 year. And of course, you also got 70,000 feet of vertical tectonic movement to explain how you get the Himalayas and the deep ocean trench. So, number one, I argue that that's scientifically impossible. It's also biblically impossible because the Bible in multiple places tells us the laws of physics haven't changed. And to get that much plate tectonic activity in that brief of a period of time, you have to change the weak nuclear force by about a factor of 1 billion times.
I got a question, Matt here. Um, so whenever I end up talking to global flood proponents, I end up hearing about a claim made that so many tribes around the world, they all have a flood myth or a folklore involving a creation, sort of a flood going on. And they say, well, they all have this flood myth, so it must be pointing back to a global flood. It's all over the world. Just kind of curious, maybe what your response is to that. Does that play into any dating? Oops, sorry, any dating techniques for the flood too?
Yeah, good question. I have a chapter in that in the book, making the point that in North and South America alone, you have nearly 300 flood stories and legends, and about that many in Australia, Africa, Asia, and Europe. What's interesting is that the story gets more distorted with respect to the biblical story the farther away you get from the Near and Middle East. And that testifies that people were taking the story with them. So you had people in one region, and then they got scattered by God. As they got scattered, they took their creation story with them, and they took their flood story with them. Now you have way more flood legends than you do have creation legends, which I would expect because creation happened previous to Noah's flood. So I make an argument that the fact that all these flood stories are so similar all over the world tells us there had to be a single major catastrophic flood that impacted humanity. And why is it all over the world? Well, it's because God aggressively scattered humanity. Now, I would argue there'd be less similarity and less legends if the migrations were natural, where people just migrated because they were seeking a better life. The forcible, rapid, simultaneous scattering fits the idea that they'd all be taking the story with them.
Speaking about carrying legends with communities, um, the Seven Sisters, that legend, would that time frame also work for carrying one story into multiple places?
Yeah, no, it's a good analogy. I mean, when you look at these 300 flood stories here in North and South America, you do see quite a bit of variation. But what I've done in Noah's Flood Revisited is to actually have a table where I show you what they have in common. And 90% say this, 60% say this, and what they don't have in common. So, for example, only 10% of them talk about a sacrifice after the flood, but 90% of them talk about a God or a system of gods that is displeased with humanity and brings a massive flood upon humanity. So, the important stuff, yeah, you see it in virtually every flood story. When you get into the details, which birds are released, that's where you see the differences. And it's a little bit like the game of telephone, where you got one story being communicated from one tribe to the next tribe. You'd expect there'd be distortion as you go from tribe to tribe to tribe.
You comment on there have been a number of expeditions to Ararat to find the Ark, and I don't think they've ever found it. But could you comment on those and what you would expect?
Well, there's some where they've gone to Mount Ararat itself, although there's a growing recognition that the Bible says the Ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat, not Mount Ararat itself. But yeah, they found pieces of wood below the glaciers on Mount Ararat. But I find interesting, they're softwoods, and the softwoods would not be suitable to build a big wooden ship at least 450 feet long. And they'd made a big claim about, hey, we dated this one piece of wood and it came back 5,500 years old. And they said that's about the time we think the Bible talks about Noah's flood. If you read the fine print, it's not a carbon-14 date. It's a cold dating method, and the error bar is quite large. It's 5,500 years ago, plus or minus 5,000 years. So I argue in Noah's Flood Revisited these pieces of wood they have found, they're softwoods, which means they're a little lighter to pack. I believe this wood is the remains of climbing huts, not Noah's Ark. I climb mountains myself, and if you're going up a high glaciated peak, the only safe way to ascend it is you take some material or wood on your back, and you basically make a tent or a hut below the high glacier. You spend the night there. You get up at 2 or 3 in the morning. You climb the peak, and you get off that peak before the sun gets very high up, because once the sun gets high up, it starts melting the ice, destabilizing the rock, and making it unsafe. We know that the Greeks and Romans in ancient times knew of this feature, and they were literally 2,500 years ago building climbing huts of that nature to climb glaciated peaks. Now, the biggest buzz is a Durnipper relic that they found about 19 miles away from Mount Ararat. So it's one of the other mountains in the Ararat range. And I should show you a picture, but you can search for it. The Turkish government has actually turned it into a national park. Basically, what you see is a rock formation that looks like the hull of a big ship. And people have argued that it's the approximate dimensions of Noah's Ark. But if you carefully examine it, it's a natural geological incline, very common in mountain alpine regions. Just in climbing the mountains here in North America, I've found several natural inclines that actually better match Noah's Ark's dimensions than the one they found in Turkey. So there is no evidence for Noah's Ark, and I argue that, hey, given how strong the wood was that was used to build Noah's Ark, it would have been too valuable for post-flood peoples to leave lying around. They would have raided that wood and used it for building their homes and their cities and villages. So people have asked me, well, is there any hope of finding the remains of Noah's Ark? I said, maybe in the ashes of Nineveh. Nineveh is really close to the foothills of Ararat, and if that's where the Ark came to rest, they would have raided the wood and used it to build Nineveh, but Nineveh's been burnt to the ground several times. So all you're going to find at best are the ashes of the wood from Noah's Ark.
Question. You've done a good job with talking about the date of Noah's Ark. What do you have an opinion as to the amount of time between Adam and Eve and Noah?
Yeah, I do address that in the book, where I talk about the mathematical genetics models that are used to try to trace the diversity of present-day human DNA back to when it would all come from a single man and a single woman. Those dates are earlier than what you get for Noah's flood, obviously, because Adam lived before Noah. But you're now in a region where you got really big systematic errors. And so the date you get for the first man is 96,000 years ago to 204,000 years ago, and you get a similar date for the first woman. So the error bars are literally plus or minus 50,000 years, and maybe even more. So, but somewhere in that neighborhood, 100 to 200,000 years ago, and the dates could be as early as 70,000 years ago. They could be as late as 230,000 years ago. But I would argue the error bars, if you include the systematic errors, are at least 80,000 years, plus or minus 80,000 years.
That's a
But
lot.
it's enough to tell us that, Adam and Eve did predate Noah.
Is there anything in scripture that would give hints as to the amount of time between Adam and Noah?
Not much. I gave you the evidence for why Noah's flood has to be an ice age event. What I did in my book, Navigating Genesis, is to give you biblical evidence for why Adam and Eve had to be living during an ice age, because Genesis 2 describes 4 known rivers, 2 which flow today. The other 2 were flowing during the last ice age. Genesis 2 tells us where those four waters came from, but also says they came close together in the Garden of Eden. The location where they come close together today is more than 200 feet below sea level, namely in the southeastern portion of the Persian Gulf, but during the last ice age, it would have been above sea level. So, very roughly, Adam and Eve lived likely sometime during the previous ice age. If you really want to stretch it, you could say, well, maybe it even goes back to the second ice age before the previous event. So, but again, the genetic dates give you quite a broad spread of possibilities.
You mentioned the rivers. I always wondered about if there was a global flood. They talk about the rivers before the flood, but those rivers, at least two of them, I guess, are still around, or maybe all four.
Well,
how does that
all
work?
four are around, but two of them are dry riverbeds.
Okay.
But you can see where they were flowing.
So if there was a global flood that was so catastrophic to carve the Grand Canyon, wouldn't it do something to those rivers?
Very good point. Why do we still have evidence for the Gihon, the Pishon, and actually see the riverbeds where they were flowing? We shouldn't see that if you've got 24,000 plus kilometers of plate tectonic movement during Noah's flood. It should have erased that evidence. So yeah, you're making a very good point. The fact that it hasn't is an argument that the flood can't be global.
I have to thank my friend Tim for some of the insights on that one. Oh, the other thing is if there's anybody in the Zoom land there that have questions, feel free to ask them. I know that a lot of us we've been brought up with the idea of it being a global flood. So if you have some doubts or some questions that you want answered, feel free to speak up. Use ready for the questions.
Yeah, we have a question. This is Paul and friends.
So I was wondering, because you said Noah probably lived during an ice age. In the Bible, to me, it makes it clear that he lived in like the desert or somewhere where there wasn't an excess of water. Would he have lived somewhere where there was ice, like the ice age, or would he have lived in a desert?
Well, for example, the four rivers that are mentioned in Genesis 2, they start in the mountains and they flow down into the plains. And it's a region of the world that was warm even during an ice age. So yeah, there'd be no snow or ice on the plains, but there'd be plenty of snow and ice on the mountains from where they flowed, which explains why they don't flow today. The Gihon, the Pishon are dry riverbeds because the mountains of Western Arabia and Southwestern Arabia are totally ice and snow free. But during the last ice age, they had snow and ice. So, and people often ask me, hey, if Adam and Eve go back to the previous ice age, how did Adam and Eve manage to be in the garden without clothes?
Thank you.
Well, well, they were living in the southeast portion of the Persian Gulf, and that's actually the hottest place in the world today. I mean, one argument I have for why Genesis gets it right is that if you have to have Adam and Eve living during an ice age to be able to survive in that part of the world without air conditioning. So if it's an ice age, they'd be comfortable in the Garden of Eden. If it's during an interglacial, they would really have a hard time.
Thank you.
I have another question. It seemed like you were waiting on the dating for the mass migration to come through before you published your book, which means those are pretty recent publications. And with much of your argument depending upon those dates, kind of where does this land in terms of settled and accepted theories of that?
Yeah, good question. I mean, the scientific literature about these great migrations goes back 40 years, but there was quite a bit of debate about when these great migrations occurred. We knew the routes. was very clear that the southern shore of Asia and the shores of Africa and North America were the routes that were used. We knew how fast they went, but the dates weren't that well determined. We're looking at error bars of, say, plus or minus 10,000 years. Now we got the error bars down to about plus or minus 2 or 3,000 years. That's what's different. So I knew these better measurements were coming. So the concept was already there 40 years ago. But now we have, consistent dates, and the error bars are way smaller than they used to be. And so I said, hey, now that we got that data, I can publish this book because, people aren't going to say, oh, gee, maybe you're off by 20,000 years. No, we now know we're not off by 20,000 years.
Thank you. And thanks for the presentation tonight.
Oh, you're welcome.
Hello, my name is Rosemary, and I have a question. I remember seeing a while ago an estimate of what the population would have been before Noah's flood. And I think it was something like 10 billion people in the world. So, do you have an estimate of how many people were wiped out in Noah's flood?
Yes, this is actually addressed in Navigating Genesis. So I didn't put much in Noah's Flood Revisited. There's actually a more extensive discussion of that in Navigating Genesis, making the point that there's real evidence that people before the flood had the potential to live 900 years, Methuselah 969. And if it wasn't for the sin of murder, the human population would have exploded. So when God told Adam, multiply and fill the earth, if it wasn't for people killing one another, by the time Adam was 760 years of age, there would have been a minimum of 17 billion people on the face of the earth. And I'm being very conservative here. I'm assuming that women are only reproductive for 500 years, and assuming they were trying to control birth, but the technology at that time means all you got at your disposal is the rhythm method without thermometers. So you're going to get at least one child per woman every 4 years. And I just show you how rapidly the population explodes with a conservative birth rate. Literally 17 billion people before Adam is even dead. Now, clearly that didn't happen. And so I argue that in the days before Noah, the murder rate had to be above 90%, maybe even above 95%. And I suggest that the average lifespan of people today is longer than the average lifespan of people living in the days before Noah. Likely people were being killed when they were 20, 30, 40 years of age by their fellow man rather than living out to be 800 or 900 years of age. And I speculate that maybe what we see in the Genesis 5 genealogy is the handful of patriarchs that died a natural death, as opposed to being murdered by their fellow man. And I write about that in Noah's Flood Revisited to make the point that the flood was really an expression of God's mercy. Humanity was in danger of self-extermination. So God stepped in to prevent humanity from wiping itself out. And also explains why, in Genesis chapter 9, God spoke to Noah in very direct, harsh terms. You have to stop this murder. Whatever it takes, you must restrain it, up to the death penalty if needed, to keep murder from getting out of control. And then he also shortened the human lifespan down to 120. You don't want serial killers living to be 900 years of age.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful.
One thing I just wanted to add to that question was, I forget where it is, Hugh, you might know, but it talks about how evil the society was before the flood. I forget what the words are they use in the Bible. Maybe you happen to know what the words are.
Yeah, the Hebrew words are Shemach and Hamas. And these are words that are used to describe the evil of the antediluvian peoples. Hamas, for example, means that all they could think about, how can I do physical harm to my fellow human beings? Shemach means they're incapable of thinking anything good. All they could think about was, how can I do evil? They're incapable of forgiving. They're incapable of even recognizing that something is good. They call good evil, and they call evil good. So it's an unprecedented time in human society where literally all they could think about, how can I harm my fellow human being?
Just saying another pre-flood condition was there was a half-breed race of beings living when the sons of God cohabited with the daughters of men. Would that be part of the reason for the flood, to wipe them out?
Yes, part of the reason for the flood is to get rid of the Nephilim that are a result of intercourse between the sons of God and the daughters of men. The biblical text says that after the flood, the sons of God came back, and so there is a second generation of Nephilim, which explains why God was so focused on getting rid of the last of the Nephilim. So part of the exodus of the Israelites under Moses' direction was to get rid of the Nephilim living in that area. And then David's mighty men killed off the last of the Nephilim. So evidently they were propagators of great evil.
Any other questions? Well, I'll ask, I have a question. It seems to me, and prior to my enlightenment by you, actually, having come from a young Earth background, it seems like those who are proponents of a global flood and very young Earth are very vociferous and actually in some ways aggressive in terms of their proselytizing of that view. Could you comment on how we approach fellow Christians who have a very different understanding of Scripture and nature, and how we are a good witness in the world to bring people to Christ?
Well, I remind my young Earth friends that, the non-believing world is watching us. And, it tells us in 2 Corinthians 5, we are ambassadors trying to encourage unbelievers to make their peace with God. But what gets in the way is when the unbelievers see Christians treating one another rather viciously. And so how we behave to one another is important. So I'd encourage us, yes, I get called all kinds of names by young earth creationists literally on a daily basis. Even a couple of hours ago, I was looking at my social media. I was referred to as the most dangerous man on the planet, and that nobody should have anything to do with me because of the, quote, lies I'm spreading about science and the Bible. And the Bible encourages us. When you're treated with that kind of libel or slander, we're to return good for evil. And for no other reason, non-Christians are watching us. And also, perhaps these people will begin to listen to our appeal. What I'm discovering with my young Earth friends, as much as they seem really upset about the Earth being a few billion years old, they do value biblical inerrancy more than they do their belief about the flood or their belief about the age of the Earth. And so I've been basically trying to show them, hey, if you read all the biblical texts on creation, literally and consistently, it's impossible to defend young Earth creationism. It's impossible to defend a global flood. So I just encourage them, you need to look at more than just Genesis. There are 66 books of the Bible. Read them all. And so I like to give them, here are the texts. You don't have to read the whole Bible, just look at these creation texts and draw your own conclusion. And you'll see a summary of all that in my book, Rescuing Inerrancy. You know, I thought, hey, I got this book in a matter of days. It's an exhaustive treatment of why young earth creationism is not biblically defensible, but it's 400 pages long. And I found out that, hey, if I can condense it down to 10 pages, I got a better chance of them reading it. So that's what I did in Rescuing Inerrancy. I boiled it down to just 10 pages.
Back to the Nephilim. The book says the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and they came into them and had them. Well, the word for God is El, I think there.
Mm-hmm.
And from what I understand, it's a uniplural. And I would postulate that possibly where all of our Bible texts are using a capital G there, it actually should be a lowercase g. That is the sons of the gods. That is those people who do not follow the one true God, saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took wives, that these are actually evil men. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I have a whole chapter on this subject, plus an appendix in Navigating Genesis, making the point that amongst Bible scholars today, there are three theories on the sons of God and the Nephilim. One theory is that the sons of God are fallen angels, and these angels had intercourse with the daughters of men and gave rise to this hybrid species. A second theory is that they're demon-possessed men. And a third theory is that God probably commanded the sons of Seth not to marry the daughters of Cain, but some of them went ahead and did it anyway. Now, that third theory is unique to modern times. You don't see that if you go previous to 200 years ago in the biblical literature, the theological literature. So it's a relatively new idea. And so what I did in Navigating Genesis is give you the biblical arguments for and against all three theories. But I think what's helpful is I have an appendix in Navigating Genesis where I give you every place in the Bible that uses the term sons of God or children of God, and I contrast that with every place in the Bible where it talks about children of men and sons of men. And what you notice is nowhere in the Old Testament are humans called sons of God, although there's one passage that says a time will come when humans will be sons of God, but it's in the future. And what you see in the New Testament is that the disciples of Jesus did not take the title sons of God until after the days of Pentecost. Before that, Jesus exclusively referred to them as sons of men. The other interesting thing is Jesus referred to himself as the Son of Man before his resurrection, and he's exclusively referred to as the Son of God after his resurrection. So on that basis, people have argued that maybe these sons of God are angelic beings, because in the Old Testament era, only angels could be called sons of God. And then you've got an obscure passage in Jude 6, which accuses certain fallen angels of leaving their estate, and because they left their estate, God consigned them to the abyss. And what you see in the gospel accounts is when Jesus would cast out demons, they would always say, "Do not send us to the abyss." Notice Jesus never did. And so Bible scholars have argued that the abyss is a special prison for fallen angels that violated God's command about having relations with individuals that are not part of their species. Because leaving their estate in the original Greek is a phrase that's typically translated as committing bestiality. So, but you'll find all this in Navigating Genesis, and the appendix. But the other thing you notice about the Nephilim when you get into the books of Samuel is that they have superhuman height and strength. The thing about humans is because we're bipedal, the taller we are, the muscles or the bones to support our body go up geometrically with our height, which explains why tall individuals typically are less mobile than individuals who don't have a lot of height. And so I got a piece in Navigating Genesis called The Physics of Basketball. Basketball is a sport where your capacity to sink a basket goes up with a square of your height. So you'd anticipate 7-foot tall basketball players should sink twice as many baskets as 5-foot tall basketball players. But in the NBA, that doesn't play out because the ones that are 7 feet tall are less mobile than the players that are 6 feet tall. And so typically people that are 6'6" wind up scoring the most baskets because they got significant mobility, but they also got a little bit of height. So they kind of compromise it. But it's well known no human can live that's more than 9 feet tall. If you're more than 9 feet tall, your bone mass is so great that you wind up quickly dying of exhaustion. And yet we got Goliath, who's a minimum of 9 feet 9 inches tall, and he carried a minimum of 250 pounds of weapons and armor into battle. That would be physically impossible for someone who didn't have a supernatural enhancement of their human body. And by the way, you got Og the king and Bashan, who is probably 12 feet tall.
Speaking of which, big guys and old guys, there was one non-biblical text that had a king living for 1,000 years, wasn't there?
Yes, you see that in the Akkadian and Sumerian records of the kings, where they record how long their kings lived. And yes, some of them they say claim lived 10,000 years. But the other thing we notice about the Sumerian and the Akkadian, you even see it in the Egyptian historical records, is that they all exaggerate. And so when you take into account the exaggerations, it's often given by Bible scholars, hey, if they're saying 10,000 years, that gives credence to the biblical claim that there were people in the days before the flood that were living to be 969 years. What I've done in both Navigating Genesis and gave an update in Noah's Flood Revisited is that we got solid scientific evidence that if you're going back 50, 60,000 years ago, conditions were such that people could easily live many centuries beyond we can live today. They were living in a radiation environment way less than what we live in today. And they were on a vegetarian diet, and they were not being exposed to igneous rocks to the degree we are today. So it's impossible for anyone to live beyond 120 years today, but in the days before the flood, that impossibility was not in place.
Have they been able to find any archaeological evidence of individuals that were really old?
No, because the oldest human remains we have are about 40 to 45,000 years. We got nothing older than that.
Maybe we're looking for something 45,500 years old or something. Maybe.
Yeah. Well, not only that, typically we find bones of people that have been dead for 40,000 years. They're people who died in their youth. In other words, there's an injury or you could see disease that would have caused them to die at a relatively young age. Yeah, it'd be great if we could recover those kinds of bones, but so far we don't have that evidence.
So I have a question. So the premise of that comment was that I think there was death before sin in the garden. Is that accurate?
There was no human death, but there was certainly death of plants and animals. After all, you got Adam and Eve eating in the Garden of Eden before they sinned. When you eat, something dies. So, yeah, there's no
Death of
question that
death of
death existed. It's just that there's no human death.
human death.
And Romans 5:12 is explicit. Death through sin was visited upon all people. Notice Paul does not say all life. He says all people. Also notice only one species on earth can sin. So when he says death through sin came upon all people, twice he's qualifying that he's only referring to human death. And he repeats that in 1 Corinthians 15.
So there were people before Adam and Eve.
No, I'm not claiming there were people before Adam and Eve.
Okay, so you're bringing Adam and Eve way back.
Yeah, I think Adam and Eve go back probably about 100,000 years ago.
Okay.
And the Neanderthals were not human. I mean, there's a radical difference between us and the bipedal primates. We're spiritual, they are not.
What do you think somebody mentioned a little while ago about vegetarian diets and such. What do you think about seems like I remember something about when Noah got off the ark that God blessed the animals or something to eat. Is there something to that, or is it possible that before Noah they weren't supposed to eat meat and afterwards they were, or is that just?
No, there's validity for that. What you see in Genesis chapter 9, God basically said, previously, I had you on a vegetarian diet. Now you can also eat meat. And mainly he's pointing about the fact you're not going to live long enough for it to make any difference anyway. So go ahead and eat the meat. If you want to live to be 900, you better avoid meat. When you eat meat, you're concentrating heavy metals in your body at 1,000 times the rate that you do if you eat only vegetable material. And hey, if you're only going to make it to 120, I'd say don't worry about the heavy metals. But if you want to make it to 900, it's important that you really limit how many heavy metals you accumulate in your body.
So Methuselah probably was a vegetarian?
I think he was a vegetarian.
Interesting.
Now, I argue because of the evil of humanity, there were probably a lot of people before the flood that were eating meat. But the prohibition was in place. You need to be on a vegetarian diet. I'm not saying everybody obeyed that.
But Noah probably did because he lived pretty long.
Yeah, he made it to 950. So good chance he was on a vegetarian diet, at least before the flood.
And that would have been considered being obedient to God to be a vegetarian before the flood?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Oh, I just thought of something else. I was just thinking about you just finished this book. What's your future? Are you going to be doing any more books? Just kind of curious.
Oh, yes. I got several more books I want to write. So I'm not going to retire, guys.
That's good. That's good.
No, probably my next book's going to be a sequel to Weathering Climate Change. But I've accumulated a lot of research for the book already.
Yes, that was a good one. Thanks.
Sure.
I really enjoyed Weathering Climate Change. Is it going to be a strict sequel, or is it going to be a rewrite of?
Oh, no. It's going to be quite a different book, basically arguing for a new energy policy that will boost the world economy, benefit the world's ecosystems, and solve the major health crisis that's impacting all of Asia. I mean, so there's a lot that's been discovered that I didn't have a chance to put into Weathering Climate Change. So this will be a standalone book, but it's also designed to complement what's in Weathering Climate Change. And my next book that's going to be released, it's already written. It's an editorial right now. is on the theme of extraterrestrial life and UAPs.
Then the third sequel to Weathering Climate Change is going to be called Yay Thorium.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about thorium and weathering climate change, but didn't have a chance because I was past the page count. I'm going to get it in this new book.
So the most popular models for human migration are out of Africa. Can you comment on how that fits with the biblical text? And are they speaking of Northeast Africa, or how would you reconcile that?
Yeah, there is a lot of evidence that the greatest genetic diversity we see with humanity is in Eastern and Southern Africa. And that's the basis for the out of Africa hypothesis, is that humans migrated from that region, all the parts of the world. Excuse me. Also, it seems like we got the most ancient evidence for humans, excuse me, in that part of the world. However, although they have relics that date back to 80,000 years ago in southern and eastern Africa, the error bars on those relics are plus or minus 35,000 years. And now we found relics in Asia that likewise date to 80,000 years ago, plus or minus 35,000 years. The dates I put in Noah's Flood Revisited are the ones where we got small error bars. And those dates are all coming in at 40 to 50,000 years ago. I would also argue that we have to be cautious about overinterpreting the genetic data in Africa, because we notice in Eastern and Southern Africa is where you got strong tribalism, basically where you got tribes that refuse to intermarry with adjoining tribes. Well, that's a prescription for retaining huge genetic diversity. So, for example, where you see the greatest genetic diversity amongst the different races of humans today is between the Bantu blacks and the Zulu blacks, both of which live in South Africa. And they only live a couple hundred miles apart from one another. But that's where you have the greatest genetic diversity. The diversity between the Zulu blacks and the Bantu blacks is greater than either one of them with Caucasians or with the Oriental races. So, but my colleague Fazal Rana has argued there's not all that much genetic diversity amongst the races. But the fact that we see the greatest diversity in Southern Africa may be more indicative of their social structures than how far back in time they lived. I'll give you another specific example of that. This comes from the notes of the missionary David Livingstone, where he was in the Congo region and he discovered a tribe of people with an average height of 3.5 feet tall, living just a few miles from another tribe where the average height was 7 feet tall. And that kind of mystified him. But the mystery is easily resolved. The 3.5-footers refused to intermarry with the 7-footers. So they maintained their genetic diversity even though they lived just a few miles apart from one another.
Yeah, we have time for a few more questions. Anyone who hasn't asked a question, this is your opportunity. You can see Hugh is encyclopedic in terms of his background. So this is your chance. So please unmute yourself if you're on Zoom and ask a question. And
Yeah, Dr. Ross.
Yes.
Just a lot of talk and controversy about AI. And in these last minutes, I was just curious and wanted to know what your take on that was.
Well, I've written a couple of articles on artificial intelligence, one based on a study out of Japan where they did experiments on how to best integrate humans with artificial intelligence. And the bottom line is they discovered you get the best results when you partner an advanced AI system with the very best human experts in the area, and particularly the experienced experts, people who've been in the area for 20, 30 years, as opposed to the junior engineers and scientists that are just starting out. And so, for example, I've experimented a bit with AI, and I noticed, for example, that you want to control the AI. AI is a habit of going off on tangents. So one of the things we're doing at Reasons to Believe now is we're writing our material with AI in mind. Basically, when we write, we anticipate where can artificial intelligence go off on a tangent or go down a path we don't want it to go. So basically writing the piece to try to stop AI from going places we don't want them to go, and also to channel the AI into a direction we do want it to go. And if you ever use an AI system, the best ones give you an answer, but they also ask you a question. How well did I do? Are you satisfied with the answer I gave you? And because AI is self-learning, if it figures out that you were disappointed, it's going to make note of that and not go down that path the next time. I mean, I saw that even years ago when I was using Google Translate to communicate with a physicist in Ukraine. He didn't know English and I didn't know Ukrainian, but we used Google Translate. And the first back and forth we did, it was awful. But after about 3 months of doing back and forth, it's like he was fluent in English and I was fluent in Ukrainian. And it's because the AI system basically figured out, hey, I'm talking to two physicists, this is different, and I need to make adjustments. And it kept making adjustments, and eventually it got to be very good at it. So AI is here to stay. We need to learn how to use it. But one thing I've learned, for example, I can take a very high-level article I've written. I can ask AI, please convert this into something that's readable for someone with an 8th grade reading level. But I better give it tiny chunks. So I basically feed it 2 or 3 sentences at a time, and I tell it to go slowly. Hey, take this 18th grade graduate level item and bring it down to senior undergrad. Then I have it take it down to, say, junior undergrad, then sophomore, then high school level, and eventually get it down to grade 8. But if I feed it more than a paragraph, it's going to make a bad job of it. So, and I'm constantly reviewing the results. But what I notice is if I feed it tiny pieces and give it small incremental steps, eventually it gets better and better and gets me what I want at a faster and faster rate.
If I may add something to that process, I don't use that process, but if I start with ChatGPT 5.2, I can write an article, send it over to Gemini, send it to Perplexity, get it over to Grok, finish it up in Claude, bring it back to ChatGPT, and you've got a finely honed article. You
that works
maneuver
well.
through all the different AIs.
Well, each AI has an advantage. So it pays to know what the advantages of each AI system is.
Yeah.
And one reason why I like to use lots of different ones, I'm trying to do it where I don't have to pay any money. And so, as you know, AI is designed to get you to subscribe. So,
yeah.
So
I think I'm spending about $40 a month on a couple of them right now.
that's right. Yeah, it's getting that way. However, what is, I think, tempering in all this, the world's largest AI system that only focuses on mathematics, when you give it grade 9 algebra tests, it gets only a 50% score.
Interesting.
Yeah, it can't reason. All it can do is analyze math that's been fed to it. So it's very good at analyzing, but if it doesn't have the right math problem in its database, it's going to fail.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing we need to recognize. It's incredibly powerful and fast at analyzing databases we feed to it. but it's totally dependent on the databases. It can't reason. So as long as we recognize that, I think we can get the results that we need. What I love about it, I can feed it a really technical article and tell it, please turn this into a comic book.
Yeah.
It'll do that in a few seconds. I can't believe how fast it does it. And what we're doing at Reasons to Believe is we're giving it really technical articles and say, turn this into a podcast. And it creates two avatars that communicate with one another. And they put graphics on a whiteboard. And literally, they do it all in 15 seconds. It's incredible.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Ross. Really enjoyed this tonight. Thank
It's my
you.
pleasure.
We're getting close to the end, but if there's another question, this is your chance. I'll give you a few seconds here, a few minutes. Well, and while you're thinking, I'm going to show you the book that Hugh has written, and a generous contribution by Reasons to Believe is we have some books here tonight. For those of you who are in the room, you will all get a free copy. So we are very grateful and thankful. And for those of you who don't know our background, we were a chapter of Reasons to Believe until about 2 years ago when the chapters were discontinued. So we are very thankful to have an ongoing connection with Reasons to Believe ministry and for Dr. Ross. So thank you very much. It was delightful.
Yeah, and just to be really clear, we're not discouraging chapters. We're just telling you we can't provide the technical and financial support that we used to in the old days, but we love it that you're still meeting. So go for it.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks for your encouragement. And thanks for all the support that you and all the others Reasons to Believe give us here at Science, Scripture, and Reason.
Yeah, and keep in mind you've got access to 360 scholars in our scholar community. So yeah, if you see someone you want to bring in for a meeting like this, please contact us.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. Speaking of a Reasons to Believe scholar, next month, Dr. Michael Strauss will be with us, and he'll be talking about the design of the universe and all the way down to fundamental particles and quantum physics and so forth. So I think it's going to be a very interesting educational meeting next month, and I'll invite all of you back who can attend. We do record these, and if you want to revisit one of our meetings, you will be free to do so. One thing I find out is that I need to read or listen to things several times because I always miss something. So please visit our website, www.ssreason.org. Thank you. Yes. Don't do what I said. Just do it. www.ssreason.org. Science, Scripture, and Reason. Okay. And then we will love to have you sign up also for ongoing announcements that you can do from our website. So it will come to you automatically by email. And we promise not to spam you too much with that. So again, Hugh, thank you so much for being with us this evening. Very much appreciate your time and expertise. And again, I will encourage everyone to look for this book. Amongst, as you know, he's written many other books that are also highly educational and insightful. And you may be like me, so whatever Hugh writes, I try to find and read. Thank you, and good night to all of you on Zoom, and those of you who are in the room. We will distribute books.
One last comment.
Oh,
Thank you.
Tim, you want to make a comment?
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
It was about 25 years ago when you saved me out of the young earth prison. And I just want to say that since then, you've been the most influential person in my life outside of Jesus Christ. And I appreciate you.
Well, thank you.
I think I think there's some similar stories in the room here, so thank you, Hugh.
You're very welcome. Very encouraging.
Thank you. Okay, well, the Lord bless you, and thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you next month.